Hey, what's up gamers? I consider myself a pretty competent player. I'm no pro, but I have been playing games pretty seriously for nearly a decade now. This level of experience means that I've been able to complete almost every challenge in a game that I've set my mind to. The key word, though, is almost. There have been some challenges that were simply too much for me at the time I attempted them. For example, in December of 2020, I beat every Shovel Knight campaign, except for King of Cards. I had played all of the campaigns in a row, and at that point I was just feeling tired of Shovel Knight. So when the final boss of this campaign gave me trouble, I decided to call it quits. But there's something you should know about me. I hate giving up, and I haven't forgotten this failure. King of Cards and I have some unfinished business. So there are really three major ways I failed when I first played King of Cards. It was the only campaign in which I didn't reach the ending, yeah. But I also completely gave up on Joustus, and I skipped past the majority of the levels. So for this video, my major goals were to finish every level, conquer every Joustus house, and finally defeat the final boss. At the same time, I wanted to reevaluate my opinion on this campaign, and give it the fair shot I previously denied it. So I started this challenge feeling honestly pretty pessimistic. I remember King Knight having a pretty stiff moveset, and you know what? I was right. But I missed something important. You see, the movement itself has never been the main draw of Shovel Knight's platforming, even for the characters with more fluid movement. No, the real appeal of Shovel Knight's platforming comes from the level gimmicks. Nearly every level in King of Cards presents a unique, one-off mechanic. So even though King Knight moves like a tungsten cube, his platforming doesn't feel too repetitive because the levels themselves are always changing. That being said, we should talk about the heirlooms. In theory, these could add some much-needed depth to King Knight's moveset, but in practice, they're still not a very notable addition. I mean, the dueling gloves are pretty funny, and they can be occasionally useful for quicker damage output. And I guess the horn is nice if you don't want to play the game. And I found one situation where I felt like using the flaming sword, so that's cool. But really, the heirlooms are just too situational to feel like a significant part of the player's toolset. Sure, there are plenty of places where you could use the heirlooms, but it takes significantly longer to recognize the situation, open the menu, equip the appropriate heirloom, and actually activate it than just approaching the challenge with your default moveset. It was definitely necessary to have these be optional, considering they consume a limited resource and are mostly exploration rewards. But as a result, they just feel underwhelming outside of the levels in which you find them. This hurts the exploration as well, because the main reason to hunt down these merit medals is just to buy more heirlooms. Personally, I wish there were more of these passive buffs you can buy in the back of the Glidewing. These are also a very situational addition to your moveset, but you don't have to actively equip them, so I still used them far more than the heirlooms. Despite those complaints though, I found myself having a lot more fun with these levels than I expected. Additionally, they were honestly a little easier than I remember, especially when I embraced my inner royal rat authority. The rat armor allows you to survive environmental hazards, which are typically an immediate death, at the comparatively low cost of just a chunk of your health. The other armor sets have their charm, but their utility is greatly outshined by a handful of rats. So, with the help of my loyal subjects, I completed every platforming stage with relative ease. One objective down. Up next were the Joustus houses. Joustus is the primary minigame in King of Cards. It's a grid-based card game about positioning and board control. I'm mixed on Joustus. On the one hand, the fundamental mechanics of the game are rock solid. The puzzle challenges are great showcases of this. For such a comparatively simple game at a glance, you need to put a surprising amount of thought and care into every move. At least, you do in theory. My main issue with the Joustus houses comes from the difficulty balancing. The regular fights in the Joustus houses are overall pretty well balanced. They lean a little on the easy side from time to time, but, well, I like winning, so that's okay. However, each Joustus house has what I can only describe as a boss battle. These players have both powerful decks and additional special abilities that can destroy your strategy. In the first Joustus house, the Black Knight absolutely wiped the floor with me. Maybe I'm just bad. Well, that's probably the case actually. But this guy beat me into the ground for a straight half hour before I finally snapped. You see, there's another thing you should know about me. As I said before, I like winning. That little dribble of dopamine is the only thing that gets me through the day. But I am not always an honorable player. I am not above playing dirty to get that win. And King of Cards had been tempting me with that forbidden fruit from the other side of the room this entire time. Chester sells cheat cards, consumable Joustus abilities that are quite frankly overpowered. I'm talking significantly more powerful than the boss's abilities. Once I bought a cheat card, I easily got my win against the Black Knight. And, well, once I had broken that seal, I had a cheat card handy for all of the upcoming boss battles. With the use of these cheat cards, each of the boss battles were significantly easier than the regular matches. So, what's the big issue here? I used an optional easy mode and it made the bosses easy. Big surprise, I know. Well, my issue is the lack of a middle ground between the difficulty options for these encounters. Without cheat cards, the bosses can be a huge brick wall, but with cheat cards, you absolutely steamroll. It loses that engaging back and forth dynamic you get in the other Joustus matches, and that's just disappointing. Still, though, I had a lot of fun with this minigame overall, so it wasn't hard to find the motivation to keep going. That's the second objective, plus a little bonus secret boss, down. This left only one more challenge for me to address, the final boss of King of Cards. Let's talk about boss combat in this campaign. It's just kind of okay. We already spoke about King Knight having limited controls, but we didn't talk about the effect this has on combat. On paper, King Knight has quite a few offensive options, but in practice, one of them definitely outshines the rest. His twirl is fast, often safer than the other options, and really the only attack that chains into itself. As a result, the offensive part of combat boils down to either actively pogoing with your twirls, or chasing and bashing to start that pogo. To make matters worse, King Knight hardly has any defensive options. Your main defensive strategy will just be to move out of the way of hazards, and, well, we've discussed how stiff that movement can be. As a result, it's barely worth it to dodge anything. In the end, I approached most boss battles with raw aggression. These fights were often still enjoyable just for being flashy and cool, but the mechanical experience was nothing to write home about. With this in mind, the final boss makes an interesting choice. For the majority of the fight, you cannot pogo on this boss. The weak points are on the side of his head, so your main option will be to shoulder bash. I actually think this was a smart design choice. The shoulder bash is pretty short and committal, so it slows down the pace of combat and leads to a more careful fight. It gives you a reason to actually learn the boss moveset, instead of just turning your brain off and rushing it down. On the other hand, though, this boss feels pretty inappropriate for your limited moveset. Over the course of the fight, it tries to restrict the safe part of the arena, either by smashing its hands to wall you off, or destroying parts of the floor. This seems like a cool idea, until you realize that the boss will be shooting projectiles at the same time. Since your main defensive option is just to move out of the way, being backed into a small part of the arena makes it a massive headache to dodge these projectiles. Beyond that, the boss has a few moves that feel like waiting periods. You might be able to safely hit the boss if you're good enough, but I never found a consistent way to pull it off. All of this makes this boss pretty frustrating. This fight didn't take me that long, only about an hour, but my issues with it made it feel far longer. I like the idea of this fight, but I really did not have fun with it. It's a shocking low point to end the campaign on. However, I did eventually beat the boss that previously made me quit. Third objective down. I had finished what I started. So, in the end, I definitely understand why I quit this campaign in the past, but I'm glad I revisited it. The platforming is just as solid as every other Shovel Knight campaign, and I had way more fun playing Joustus than I expected. Honestly, the Joustus may have been even more fun than the platforming, and that's massive praise coming from me. I was right about the combat though, these boss battles still aren't great. At least I don't have to deal with them ever again. What's that? A special message? Oh. Oh no. I'm not finished yet. But that's a video for another day. Thank you very much to the following patrons. My parents, they gave me $20 for gas. Thanks, guys.